kind of makes me sad.
All Saints Day.
Dark. All Saints Day. There we go. All right. Thank you, Meacham. Joining us now, Republican Senator from Pennsylvania, Pat Toomey. He's part of the select group of bipartisan lawmakers meeting in just a few hours to come up with a long-term budget plan for the country. Senator, thanks very much for joining us. Why don't you...
Good morning, Mika, and I promise you the sun will rise today.
You think?
Even in Washington.
Really?
I think so.
I'm skeptical.
I was going to say, if I were a politician, I would hedge that a little bit.
Yeah. The polls tell me it ain't coming.
How about that?
There you go.
Okay. Well, why don't you tell us then about what this bipartisan group is trying to do and why you think it will actually get accomplished?
Well, okay, so technically this is a conference committee to resolve the differences between a House-passed budget and a Senate-passed budget. Okay. But honestly, it's very, very difficult to imagine that we could resolve all the differences because, among other things, for instance, the Democrat-passed budget in the Senate calls for a $1 trillion tax increase. The Republican-passed budget calls for zero tax increase. So I don't think we're going to resolve comprehensively a budget resolution. What we could do is reach an agreement on funding the government for the remainder of the fiscal year and avoid any kind of drama in January when the current funding bill expires. So I hope we can do something more than that. I hope we can accomplish some real savings in the mandatory spending programs, which are actually the drivers of our long-term fiscal imbalance. But if we can get this resolved where we stick to the spending levels that are in existing law, that were passed in 2011 and signed by President Obama, substituting various alternative savings for the sequester if we can, but maintaining the savings. And then I'd suggest two other things I'd like to see. Number one, let's end government by crisis. Let's have a measure that's a standing bill that says whenever the Congress doesn't finish its appropriations process, we just have an automatic continuation at the previous year's level. Just let's avoid shutdowns. And thirdly and finally, let's give the administration some flexibility in managing through the cuts that we do have. I think if we do those three things, we'll make some progress, save some money, and avoid these manufactured crises.
All right, Sam Stein, you're next.
Yeah, Senator, can you elaborate a bit on sequestration relief? You said, as I heard you, you said you don't want to increase the spending caps, which are going to be at $967 billion when sequestration takes in effect, but you'd like to give the administration flexibility on how to manage the cuts within various agencies. Is that what you're saying is going to be the end game here?
That's not entirely the story. In my view, I think we ought to be willing to ease up a little bit on some of the sequester. That's the discretionary side of government spending, as you know, provided that there is an equal and offsetting savings in the mandatory spending category. So I want to capture the value of the savings, if you will. I want to make sure that we avoid spending more than we would otherwise spend, but I'd be very open to substituting more sensible ways to save money than the ones that we have in place now. And that said, if the cuts do have to occur, then I think the administration should have some flexibility in doing them in the most sensible fashion, not, arbitrarily across the board.
Senator Toomey, it's Willie. Good to see you this morning.
Hey, Willie.
You've been pretty open here this morning and previously that your goals are more modest about a budget deal than they've been in the past. The so-called grand bargain doesn't appear to be on the table this time. What will it take, if not at this deal, someday down the road, next year, 2 years, 5 years from now, to get a real grand bargain, if we still want to use that term, which would involve revenue cuts, raising revenue on the Democratic side, and entitlement cuts, which is something that you've always looked for? Both sides seem so far apart on that. The difference is so fundamental. Do you see a day when there ever is some grand bargain of some kind?
I tried real hard to make some real progress in the super committee, offered to meet my Democratic colleagues halfway, even on revenue, which was not, in my view, the optimal way to get there, but I thought it was a necessary piece. I think ultimately the answer to your question, though, lies with the President of the United States. There's only one person in this country who can bring together both sides, who can bridge some of these gaps, who can bring along his side and help us to achieve the big deal that is needed to put us on a sustainable fiscal path. I don't see the evidence that that's a priority for this president, so I'm not terribly optimistic.
Senator Harold Ford, good morning. Simpson Bowles has become something that has been embraced by, broadly speaking, by the business community and I would even dare say so about a lot of think tanks there in D.C. as well, at least big parts of it. Can you envision that, because it seems to be a balance between the revenue and spending cuts, is serving at some point as a starting point for the president, Republicans, Democrats alike, to have a more serious conversation or bigger conversation about a long-term deal?
You know, it's a good starting point. It's not a place where I'd be comfortable ending. As you know, Harold, we've already had some big tax increases on January 1st of this year. A $600 billion tax increase went into effect with no offsetting spending whatsoever, no reforms whatsoever. Associated with Obamacare, there's over $1 trillion of tax increases. So we've had a lot of tax increases. Tax revenue is now at a record high. As a percentage of GDP, it's above its historical average. So there's a lot of revenue coming in. I think we really ought to be focusing on restructuring the mandatory spending, the entitlement programs, so that they will be viable and so that we're on a sustainable fiscal path.
All right, Senator Pat Toomey, thank you very much. Great to have you on the show.
Thanks, Senator.
Thanks for having me, guys.
Coming up, our next guest company.